Hey everyone, and welcome to Unit 9. Unit 9 is plant biology. So throughout this unit, we are going to tackle all things plant. We're going to start with plant structure, of course. We're also going to get into plant reproduction, plant transport, different types of plants, adaptations they may have. Pretty much everything you've ever wanted to learn about plants, I got you covered. So let's start with the basic purpose of plants. Plants are broken into three sections. You've got leaves, you've got stems, and you've got roots. Leaves, basically all they do is photosynthesis. That's all we care about. That's all plants care about. They only want to take in CO2, release oxygen. Stems have a little bit more. They do support, right? Plants stand up straight. That's how you always see plants. They don't just lie over, and if they do, they're probably dehydrated on their way out. And transport. We're going to get super into transport in a later video, but for now you should, or you will, get pretty familiar with the terms xylem and phloem. Those are the two main transport vesicles for plants. And the last bit is roots. So of course they're used for anchorage, right? Plants don't get up and just walk around. They stay in one spot. And their big thing is water uptake. That's how plants get the majority of their water, is through their roots. Now, leaves may look like very thin little green plants, but they have a lot of stuff inside of a leaf. So we're going to go through each of the layers, and at this point, I would highly suggest drawing this picture. This is a, IB Bio Test 101, always shows up plant picture. You should definitely be familiar with the different processes inside and the different cells that make up the leaf itself. So starting at the top, working our way down. You have the upper epidermis and the cuticle. So the upper epidermis is that very top layer of cells. They're what you see when you look at a plant. They're the green cells. They pretty much exist to just be an outer layer. The cuticle is a thick, waxy layer. Typically, if you've ever held a leaf and you've kind of snapped it in half and you've heard that little snap, you're breaking the cuticle there. So the main job here is to prevent water loss. They are typically always in the sun, so they're always getting heated by the sun's rays, but what they do is prevent excess water from leaving. That's key, right? Plants need water. If they don't have water, they get dehydrated. If they get dehydrated, they die. Next layer down is the palisade mesophyll. You'll notice that these, in comparison to the blue cells underneath in the image, are very densely packed. They're so densely packed because this is where photosynthesis takes place. They need as many cells as possible to be able to produce as much glucose and oxygen as a plant needs. So they're positioned near the top because that's where the sun comes in, right? The sun hits the plant from the top, not from the bottom. So they need to be near the sun, and they need as many cells as possible to do as much photosynthesis as possible. Next area is over to the right. So this is your vascular bundle. Vascular bundle is just basically anything involved in transport. So like I said earlier, you guys are going to be very familiar with the terms xylem and phloem. In this case, or in this lecture, I guess I should say, xylem, all you need to know at this point is that it transports water, and phloem transports everything else. So all other photosynthesis products. So glucose, when you see a tree and it's very sappy, right, you've got that stickiness from it when you touch an area that might have, maybe the tree got cut and you can now see the sap flowing. That's a product that the phloem would transport. Moving on to the loosely packed area called the spongy mesophyll. You can remember that spongy is loosely packed because sponges are full of holes, right? You've seen SpongeBob. He's got a ton of holes in his body. And you've probably seen a sponge in the kitchen, right? Maybe you don't do the dishes, but you've probably seen one. Okay? So the spongy mesophyll is loosely packed. and main area for gas exchange. So CO2 comes in, oxygen goes out. So the air flow in here kind of keeps the cells pretty loosely together. They're not quite as densely packed as in the palisade. The lower epidermis is exactly the same as the upper epidermis. It's just kind of that outer layer. It's in a cooler area, right? The sun is not directly hitting it, so it has a thinner, waxy cuticle. And because of that, it's just cooler. It doesn't need as much attention, I guess, than the upper epidermis would need from you. And the last bit of a leaf are the openings that would be found in leaves. So stoma or stomata, these are the actual openings in between the cells that allow for gas exchange to happen. So when a stoma is open, CO2 can come in and O2 can go out. Stoma are only allowed to open when guard cells decide that they're going to be open, right? Stoma is literally an opening, and it's only an opening when guard cells pull apart to allow an opening in between the guard cells. So a guard cell is a cell, right, that is strictly there to control transpiration. If you remember transpiration from freshman biology, which I understand if you don't, transpiration is water loss in a plant. So a guard cell, if a plant has too much water, will be open to allow water to leave the plant. And if a guard cell is closed, it's probably because the plant is getting dehydrated and wants to keep as much water as possible inside the plant rather than allowing it to transpire. So, kind of talked about this, right? When guard cells absorb water, when they have a lot of water in the plant, they will swell. And when they swell, they open. So by swelling, they open and allow excess water to leave. If carbon dioxide levels start to fall, stoma will also open, right? The guard cells will open up to allow the stoma to be available to bring in more CO2. And then blue wavelengths in light cause a potassium ion pump to happen, which also increases the transport into cells, into leaves, because the stoma are open. You don't need to know much about the idea of these potassium ion pumps. You don't need to know like the ins and outs of it. You just need to know that blue wavelengths cause the stoma to open. So a lot of light means open stoma. Now, your first big vocab word. If you hadn't, sure, the parts of the leaf are vocab and you should know them, but typically you wouldn't ever have to define what those words are. You'd have to label them. Whereas abscisic acid, this bolded term, you would have to actually understand what it is, a definition, and there are questions that could be asked that literally just ask you to define its role in plants. So, abscisic acid is a plant hormone. It's kind of like the Hail Mary of plant hormones. If your plant is dying, abscisic acid will be released. So when a plant wilts, abscisic acid is released and forces the stoma to close. It doesn't care about anything else. It will just force stoma to close by removing potassium ions from guard cells. So now this is the opposite of what light does. When excess blue light wavelengths hit the plant, it brings potassium ions in, making the guard cells open, but abscisic acid does the opposite and forces potassium ions out, decreases water pressure, makes them flaccid, and closes the stoma. Now, that's everything to do with leaves in this lecture. We're going to start moving into the stem. For this is just a general image to kind of help you visualize what we're talking about. In plants, you have the xylem and phloem. They will always be near each other in some form of a pattern of the plant, depending on it's a dicot or monocot. So looking here, you can see that the phloem is on the outside, xylem on the inside, and in between them is cambium, which is just kind of a woody structure that separates the two. Another image that just kind of helps show what the xylem and phloem look like. So again, xylem towards the left of the like blown up image, phloem towards the right. General structure. So in xylem, it is one long tube. When xylem is being formed, like when plants are growing, you have cells that form one on top of the other, all the way up until you start to get to the leaves. As the plant matures, the cell membrane and cell wall breaks down, and mature xylem, so once the plant is matured, is dead. It's non-living. So what happens is this cell membrane of the vessel cells break down and end up making one long tube, and it's fortified with lignin for strength. So again, if you've ever picked a flower or you've gotten flowers and you've cut off the bottom of the stems and you hear that crunch, you're breaking apart this lignified wall. When you're dealing with xylem, it is a one-way transport. Water only goes from the roots to the leaves. It never ever goes the other way. For phloem, it's a little bit more complex. There's two types of cells that we're going to talk about. There's sieve tube and companion cells. So sieve tube members are developed from column cells. Column cells are like long rectangular cells. What happens is the nuclei in cytoplasm break down from these column cells and break down into what's called a sieve plate. It's basically like a little circular area in between these column cells that has a lot of holes in it, which allows the sap and the photosynthesis products to move more easily in between these cells. Companion cells, on the other hand, are not actually part of the phloem, but they're cells that exist next to the sieve tube members. So they're like just an accessory player, right? They're important, but they only connect to it and help carry out metabolic functions. They're not actually a part of the sieve tube themselves. All of this is involved with active transport, meaning that it needs energy to be able to move the sap, the photosynthesis products, whatever you want to call it. You need ATP, you need energy involved in this to be able to make it happen. We'll get more into the transport in xylem and phloem in a later video. So, just an image. Again, I like to throw a lot of images so that if you didn't pick it up in the first couple, hopefully this will help. So on the left you have xylem, again, one way, no end walls between cells, right? The membrane and wall breaks down, you make one long tube, and it's fortified with lignin, meaning it's strengthened with lignin. On the other side you have phloem. You see that it's a two-way transport, right? Arrows pointing up and down. The end point of your cells here, that's a sieve plate, so you can see the green dots there, and that just means that there are tiny openings which allow the sap to flow. All right. Next on our list is adaptations. We're going to focus on two very distinct types of plants, xerophytes and halophytes. On this slide, it's all about xerophytes. If you didn't get it from the picture, xerophytes are cacti. So desert items, anything that is surviving in extreme heat. So some of the adaptations is that they have spines instead of leaves, right? You don't see cacti that have like big, beautiful leaves that you would see on maybe flowers or maple trees. They have thick stems, which allows for massive water storage. This is super helpful, obviously, because there's not a lot of water in the desert. Their waxy cuticle is significantly thicker than a typical plant, which helps prevent water loss from the sun constantly beating down on them. They have vertical stems, right? Cacti almost look like a straight line, except for its arms. This allows cacti to absorb sun when the sun is rising and when the sun is setting, but when it's directly overhead and when it's the most warm, right? The sun is beating down, it's so hot. You don't absorb as much sun because there's not enough surface area for the sun to hit. The next two, the stomata and pits and hair-like cells on a leaf surface, cause high humidity. By causing high humidity in this area, it kind of tricks the stomata from opening and releasing excess water. Because the humidity is so high, it thinks that it's in a healthier place, right? There's more water available, so no need to release any, especially since xerophytes need to keep as much water as possible. The last bit is called C4 cam physiology. It's basically photosynthesis, but at night. You might be thinking to yourself, okay, wait, I've learned about photosynthesis, and I know that photosynthesis needs sunlight, so how the heck is this happening at night? Great question. Oh my gosh, I have a slide for it. So, you thought that it needed light, and you are correct. Photosynthesis, the process of photosynthesis, does need light. What CAM4 physiology does is breaks that process down in a different way. This image here is for those of you that are really curious about what's happening. You do not, I repeat, you do not need to copy this image down. All you need to know is that CO2, carbon dioxide, is absorbed throughout the night and stored as malic acid. Malic acid is then slowly released during the day for photosynthesis to happen. So you kind of collect all the materials at night when it's easier for cacti to survive, and then release it throughout the day, every day, so that typical plant processes can happen. So again, you don't need to draw this picture, but you do need to write the words on this slide. All right, let's talk about our next special type of plant called the halophyte. So, xerophytes were cacti, think extreme heat, desert. Halophytes, opposite, think salinity, oceans, beach grass, succulents, anything like that. So for here, you have some similar adaptations between xerophytes and halophytes, but the biggest difference is that halophytes compartmentalize sodium and chloride. So instead of keeping Na and Cl together as salt, they separate the two. So they keep sodium separate from chloride, and then if they get too much salt water, they actually secrete salt, which is so cool. For 5 and 6, sunken stomata, thickened leaves, reduced leaf surface, that's the exact same type of adaptation that xerophytes have. The big difference here is the compartmentalization and secreting actual salt. All right, now our very last bit, we're talking about roots. Again, these are just images to kind of help guide your imagery when we're talking about this stuff. I'm sure you've seen roots before, but maybe not with this much detail. So for the roots, all I really want you to know at this point is about root hairs, which increase surface area. And we're going to get into, if you look on this left-hand picture, apical meristems. We're going to get much further into those at a later date, but realistically, there's not too much about roots that I need you to know. I just kind of want you to be aware that roots exist. They're used for water uptake, they're used for anchorage, and there's a lot more than just the root itself. There's a lot of pieces in here that we're going to be talking about. All right, and our very last slide for today, terrestrial plant support. Terrestrial means land, so we're talking about land plants. We're talking about trees, we're talking about flowers, bushes, shrubs, anything like that. And there's three main ways that plants support themselves. And by supporting themselves, I mean being able to stand upright and grow into a fully matured plant. Number one is thickened cellulose. So cellulose is it's part of like a carbohydrate fatty chain. It's the number one product found in cell walls. So thickened cellulose means that cell walls are functional and thick enough to be able to stack cells one on top of another and make it so that plants can grow vertically. Cell turgor is the idea that the vacuoles inside of cells, plant cells, are full of water, which pushes the vacuoles up against all of the edges, maintaining that beautiful rectangular shape that plant cells are known for. And then the last one is xylem. So xylem is that woody material. We've talked about it a few times now. It's very hard. It makes sure that the plant stems can support themselves. So majorly important for plants that have thin stems like flowers to be able to grow upright and maintain the flower once it blooms, and the flower is much heavier than the stem itself. All right, one down. We'll get more into plants next time. Thanks for listening.